Scholars have long debated the nature of the fourth gospel. Some have classed it as a purely historical and biographical account, while others have considered it a piece of reflective literature, even a drama. Some have found John a partly historical, partly elaborated upon account of the life and teachings of Christ, and still others an appropriation of non-Christian mythology. But one approach which has regularly coursed through the diversity of Johannine studies is the consideration of the gospel as polemic. Indeed, recognizing a background of community conflict has been integral to many scholarly conclusions about the fourth gospel's intentions. Recent studies of John as polemic have, however, proven somewhat unbalanced. Much has been written on John's contest with the Jews over the identity and role of Jesus, while in recent times scholarly interest in other possible targets for the gospel has dwindled. The widespread modern notice of John's background of Jewish conflict may be largely owed to J. Lewis Martin's striking proposal that the visible conflict with the Jews in the fourth gospel is to be understood in light of Jewish expulsion of Jewish Christians from the synagogue. We have now been forced to consider the possibility that, quote, the statements in John mirror an actual historical situation and set of circumstances, end quote, and that these statements, quote, have been retrojected into the time of Jesus and his disciples, end quote. Thus, the question for the Gospel of John as to whether or not the content of the Gospel itself could reveal the times, conditions, and reasons for its composition has been opened and is yet to be shut. However, this door has revealed to the present majority a world of factional, intra-Jewish conflict. Is there room today for consideration of other, Gnostic, opponents for John's Gospel? While the internal evidence certainly lends to the view that John's Gospel is written against a background of community conflict, this line of questioning is also easily ignited by the Gospel's proximity to the Johannine epistles, which so immediately reveal an evangelist locked in combat with theological adversaries advancing on his community. Naturally following from a consideration of 1 John, another pattern of gospel study has attracted a modest measure of scholarly interest which is yet to be exhausted: John's relationship with Gnostic thought and literature. This relationship did, in fact, seem to dominate the studies of the first half of the 20th century. However, in the wake of the 1947 recovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, most New Testament scholars have recognized instead a Palestinian Jewish background for the fourth gospel. Many Johannine features once thought to be relatable only to 2nd century Hellenistic Gnostic ideas were discovered to have parallels in the Qumran documents of the 1st century CE. This caused a massive paradigm shift among scholars away from a Hellenistic background for John towards an essentially Jewish one. In this light, many conclusions about the composition of the Gospel of John, its audience, and its intentions have trended in the same general Jewish direction, though there has yet to develop any universal consensus. In order to provide a background for my own unique analysis, which draws from the very best Johannine scholarship of the past century, I will complete a brief survey of opinions on the fourth gospel's destination and purpose, but without any intention of exhausting the many divergent viewpoints which have emerged. Ancient views. The opinion that the fourth gospel was composed to refute Gnostic ideas is an ancient one. Irenaeus of Lyon, who lived from 130 to 202 CE, wrote that John was engaged in a personal conflict with the Gnostic Cerinthus, flourishing around 100 CE, and that John's Gospel was specifically an antidote to this heresy. J.D. Michaelis once argued that, quote, even if Irenaeus had not asserted that St. John wrote his Gospel against the Gnostics, and particularly against Cerinthus, the contents of the Gospel itself would lead to this conclusion. The speeches of Christ, which John had recorded, are selected with a totally different view from that of the first 3 evangelists. In the very choice of his expressions, such as light, life, etc., he had in view the philosophy of the Gnostics, who used, or rather abused, these terms. Unless John had an adversary to combat who made particular use of the words, he would not have thought it necessary, end quote. Interestingly, we find that in the late 2nd century, Cerinthus' name was attached to the Gospel in two radically different ways. Some Christians, like Irenaeus, indeed held the Gospel to be written against Cerinthus, while some Christians, like the ultra-conservative Alogi sect, held that it was actually written by Cerinthus. What could account for such radically divergent opinions? Similarly, modern scholars have continued to ask if the Gospel of John is not only an answer to Gnostic heresy, but is also a product of Gnosticism itself. Could both Irenaeus and the Alogi be correct? Could the Gospel of John be simultaneously Gnostic and anti-Gnostic? The difficulty in properly recognizing the Gospel's unique method, and its tendency to draw near to Gnostic ways of thinking, seems to have enabled such divergent conclusions. The original difficulty early Christians had with the Gospel of John was probably generated not only by the Gospel's subtle and peculiar approach, but because proto-orthodoxy had already experienced a dramatic enough philosophical and theological shift by the late 2nd century that its doctrines were becoming hard to distinguish from the Gnostic worldview which the Fourth Gospel was regularly working against. Modern scholars may be encountering the same difficulties for the same reasons. E. F. Scott. Long before the discovery of the Nag Hammadi Codices stirred a new interest in Gnosticism, biblical scholars were already exploring the possibility that John had written his Gospel with Gnostic ideas in mind. In 1906, E. F. Scott laid an important foundation for considering John as anti-Gnostic polemic in his The Fourth Gospel. For Scott, John represented a transitional gospel in which John was restating the Christian message for a Hellenistic culture in terms of current philosophy. For example, the Johannine eternal life he found to be an essential translation of the Jewish kingdom of God. But Scott furthermore detected other polemical motivations in John. He saw the gospel working in several different directions, namely against the Jews, the Baptist sect, and against the Gnostics, even demonstrating an anti-Docetic tone. However, Scott surprisingly found John to be simultaneously sympathetic towards Gnosticism, and indeed semi-Docetic himself. For Scott, John still stressed the ideal value of Jesus' life, cosmic dualism, and gnosis of God. Scott still viewed John's Jesus as a divine and spiritual being. Scott believed he could resolve the antinomy between John's anti-Gnostic arguments and his tendency towards Gnostic thinking by claiming that John and Gnosticism were simply drawing on the same background of ideas. Overall, Scott saw the gospel as one addressed to a Hellenistic, non-Christian audience in an attempt to persuade them to adopt Christianity. Rudolf Bultmann. In 1941, Rudolf Bultmann was moved in a similar direction as Scott, but arrived at a more dramatic conclusion. Bultmann caused a stir by arguing that the Gospel of John was based upon a Gnostic discourse source related to Mandean concepts and literature, a source which was later altered by members of the Johannine community to reflect an anti-Gnostic viewpoint. Bultmann even argued that the author was actually a former Gnostic disciple of John the Baptist's sect, and that John's prologue was, in fact, composed precisely to combat that sect. Similar to Scott, in Bultmann's view, the Fourth Gospel is ultimately a work which is at its core both Gnostic as well as anti-Gnostic. Though Bultmann's interpretation eventually fell out of favor, largely due to the absence of the alleged source material and the late date for the Mandean sect to which Bultmann drew attention, Bultmann's effort continued to draw at the possibility that John was an anti-Gnostic polemic. C. H. Dodd. The history of religion school had, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, seen the Gospel of John almost entirely in terms of Hellenism. Thus, the Gospel's Jewish affinities were regularly downplayed. Reasons for the overturning of the imbalance included the important studies in Semitic languages and rabbinical Judaism. In the aftermath of these studies, an attempt at rebalancing was to be found in C.H. Dodd's landmark Interpretation of the Fourth Gospel, 1953. Dodd emphasized, much more than Bultmann, the relationship of the Gospel with the Jews and Judaism. However, Dodd also compared John to Hellenistic Judaism as represented by Philo and to pagan Gnosticism as represented by Hermeticism. In each of these movements, Dodd detected a degree of affinity with the Fourth Gospel and its concepts and language. Dodd ultimately held that John was addressed to all peoples outside the church, Jewish and Gentile, and that John was in contact with the higher pagan thought of the time. Though Dodd made clear that John's own background was Jewish, like Bultmann and others, he mostly bypassed a historical contest with the Jews as the focus of the Gospel. In the end, despite the close parallels, Dodd found that John was not the work of a truly Gnostic mind. Dodd pointed to the diversity of the traditions which could be identified as Gnostic, and specifically targeted Bultmann's thesis regarding Mandean literature, ultimately exposing it as a highly improbable influence on John. Regarding Hermeticism, Dodd concluded that along with Rabbinic Judaism and Philo, the Hermetic writings, quote, remain our most direct sources for the background of thought in John, end quote, and, quote, represent a type of religious thought akin to one side of Johannine thought, without any substantial borrowing on one part or the other, end quote. Ultimately, Dodd felt that Hermeticism and Hermetic literature were not truly conscious targets of John's Gospel, but that the Hermetica represented the same philosophical tendencies held by, quote, the kind of public which John had in view, end quote. Brown, Yamauchi, Perkins, and Keener. Following Dodd, in the 1970s, Raymond E. Brown took Scott and Bultmann's awareness of a Johannine relationship with Gnosticism into account, but ultimately increased the distance between John and Gnosis. Brown concluded that the dominant source of John's ideas was to be found in sectarian Judaism. Brown wrote, quote, one cannot claim that the dependence of John on a postulated early Oriental Gnosticism has been disproved, but the hypothesis remains very tenuous and in many ways unnecessary, end quote. Immediately on Brown's trail, Edwin Yamauchi likewise resolved, perhaps with more force, that there was not yet enough evidence to prove that Gnosticism had any direct influence on John's Christianity. In the following decades, Pheme Perkins continued to separate John from the Gnostic world. She did so, while at the same time accounting for their similarities in the following way. The Gospel of John and the Gnostic writings had developed independently, but John had adopted the style of the Revelation discourse from his Hellenistic milieu, a milieu which the Gnostics simply shared. This resolution seemed to satisfy many. No true relationship with Gnosticism need disturb the reputation of the Fourth Gospel. And today, many scholars continue to put distance between the Gospel of John and Gnostic literature as texts developing independently and as merely products of a common setting. Thus, the flame once ignited by Scott, Bultmann, and Dodd was to a large degree dampened by Yamauchi and Perkins. Craig S. Keener, arguably one of the foremost commentators on John today, represents the current paradigm dominant in Johannine studies. Keener ultimately argues that, quote, the Jewish evidence is sufficient to explain the Fourth Gospel's context by itself, end quote. Like many, he distances John from any meaningful relationship with Gnosticism, Christian or Hermetic, and in his view the stunning parallels with Gnosticism are, essentially, accidental. He even goes so far as to say that, quote, none of John's purportedly Gnostic or anti-Gnostic traits are limited to Gnosticism, end quote. Regarding the affinities with Hermeticism in particular, while finding many of them significant, Keener sees them as probably reflecting only a common milieu. He thus finds the conflict in John to be set against a background of intra-Jewish dispute. John's purpose is to emphasize, even to reclaim, the Jewishness of his community in the face of Jewish leaders who challenged their identity. He locates the highest Christology in John, writing that, quote, Jesus is deity, end quote, and that he pre-existed as divine. In this, Keener's reading of the fourth gospel supports the current Trinitarian paradigm, but it also, on a basic level, supports the Gnostic thesis that Christ is by nature a spiritual being. As it stands, Keener's more isolated Jewish context for the gospel and a balanced, that is, Chalcedonian, interpretation of its Christology are today the dominant themes in Johannine study. As Kyle Kiefer observes, quote, in recent scholarship, little time is spent on dealing with the possible Gnostic background to John's gospel, end quote. Exploring the anti-Gnostic polemic hypothesis today. In 2005, in an analysis of the Johannine corpus, Feem Perkins admitted that, quote, the appropriate paradigms that would account satisfactorily for the complexity of the relationships between John and Gnosticism has not yet been articulated, end quote. There appears, then, still room and need for further analysis. Today we do benefit from the diligence of several scholars who have been unsatisfied with the progressive disassociation of John and Gnosis swelling in Bultmann's wake. Tempted perhaps by the same uncanny affinities between the two which Scott and Bultmann saw, some have continued to peer through the doorway once pried open by them, towards the study of John as an anti-Gnostic polemic. Riley, DeConnick, and Pagels. Gregory J. Riley, April DeConnick, and Elaine Pagels have all suggested that the Gospel of John is, in some ways, a response to the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is a Coptic sayings gospel discovered among the library of Gnostic documents at Nag Hammadi in 1945. And most scholars believe that Thomas is, in fact, the work of an early Christian Gnostic community, likely originating in Syria. Riley, DeConnick, and Pagels have postulated that the Gospel of John represents a conflict with this Thomasine tradition for several reasons. First, Thomas is only transformed into doubting Thomas in the fourth Gospel. This may suggest a subversive attitude towards a rival Thomasine school of thought. Furthermore, some have also detected a Docetic Christology in the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of John's presentation of a real, flesh-and-blood Jesus, whom doubting Thomas is made to touch with his hands after the resurrection, has thus been seen as refuting a Thomasine Docetism. Of course, other scholars are not convinced that the Gospel of Thomas is truly Docetic. In 2009, Christopher Skinner replied to the proposal of Riley, DeConnick, and Pagels, arguing that Thomas was not truly given special treatment apart from the other characters in the Gospel of John, and ultimately that drawing too much of a parallel between the fourth Gospel and the Gospel of Thomas was unnecessary. Regardless, the idea that an anti-Gnostic polemic is to be discovered in the Gospel of John has continued to provoke scholarly interest. Human Christology, a neglected key. Peter Borgen and George W. McRae provide examples of others who have come near to exposing John's anti-Gnostic method, or at least to asking the right questions. In Borgen's analysis, for example, we find a John who is positively Jewish Christian, as well as reliant on Jewish wisdom tradition, but a John who is also aware of Hellenistic religious trends. Alongside him, McRae asked the question, quote, is the fourth gospel an independent development from the wisdom tradition? Or is it a part of a larger movement of speculation in which Gnosticism also reinterprets wisdom? End quote. Reflecting on this question, Kyle Kiefer doubts whether or not we can ever untangle the Jewish wisdom tradition, which has been suggested forms the real background of John, from the potentially Gnostic tradition expressed in the Gospel. Attempts to discern the Orthodox Jesus from the Gnostic Jesus possibly lurking in John have certainly proven daunting for many, thanks in part to the uncanny similarities between Catholic and Gnostic Christologies. Indeed, as Daniel R. Street admits, quote, "In its more moderate form, Gnostic Christology is very difficult to differentiate from Orthodox Christology." End quote. However, the pathway to sorting out what is Jewish Christian in John and what is Gnostic or anti-Gnostic becomes clearer once we work backwards from certain assumptions about John and early Christianity which have gone widely unconsidered. On a larger scale, it is certain that the majority of scholars have heretofore neglected the power which the biblical Unitarian interpretation of John has to not only fill in John's Christological portrait, but to harmonize it with the human Jesus of the Synoptics and the monotheism of the Hebrew Bible. And ultimately, Morgan and others who have drawn near to exposing John's polemic have relied overmuch on the philosophical principles which John was refuting in order to draw out the positive side of the Johannine Christology. The biblical Unitarian reading, which sees in John's Jesus a human being apart from any literal pre-existence, is one which sheds much needed light on the careful distinctions we need to make in order to recognize the true nature of John's polemic. In our next entry, we'll consider John's audience, his overall mission for his gospel, and the unique method by which he hoped to achieve it.